Young people today are the loneliest generation. So this, 18 to 24-year-olds or whatever, are the loneliest generation. So they are lonelier than elderly. If social media was a great place to connect and they're on it for 3-4 hours a day,
where's the connection?
Why are they lonely?
Yeah.
What I like to look at is, what we know is good for child development and how might social media be interfering with that. So we know that children are meant to be playing, spending time in nature, having lots of downtime for when they get older, for the adolescent years, for self-reflection. The really strong one is obviously sleep. So we know sleep's really important for all kinds of brain development. So sleeping is almost like a bath for the brain, so it gets rid of toxins from the brain when you're asleep. And so if something's interfering with these processes, we need to be mindful of that. Parents are drowning. This is a societal issue, and we're not going to see massive change, I don't think, until we begin to shift some social norms. And education, important for understanding the problem, but it's not going to shift these norms.
Kia ora and welcome to One Young Mind podcast. It's a fact that our young people live in an increasingly addictive digital world, and whilst that world can bring a lot of positives, what exactly are the risks? I'm Matilda Green, content creator, presenter and mother of 3.
And I'm Dr Manish Deva, paediatrician. This podcast discusses mental health issues, self-harm and suicide, so please listen with care. If you or someone you love is struggling, please reach out to a professional for help. Helpline numbers can be found in the show notes of this podcast.
Dr Samantha Marsh, a very warm welcome to the show. Should we kick off with just a little bit of a background piece? How did you get into this line of work that you're in?
So I started doing a PhD about almost 15 years ago now, and that was back in the days when we were looking at screens from the perception that they were causing an obesity epidemic, and they were contributing to that because they were sedentary. Mm-hmm. So I looked at how different screens impacted on the way kids eat. But when I was doing that research, I did a lot of reviews, but I also spoke to a lot of parents, and it became really obvious to me that screen use was interfering with parent-children relationships. And that seemed really important, so like how it interferes with the family. So that kind of coincided as well with having a daughter who isn't rewardable or punishable. So I got really into child development and did some training with Gordon Newfeld in Canada, who's a developmental psychologist. And that from then on kind of shifted all my research moving forward. Then came 2017, Jean Twenge, who is a psychologist in America. She wrote a book called iGen, where she basically raised the alarm that there seemed to be something going on with youth mental health. And then she did a whole lot of research trying to figure out what might be driving that cause. And she kind of identified smartphones and really later social media. So I then became very interested in that, putting in grants and doing research, looking at the impact of social media on our kids.
I love that term. You've got a child who isn't rewardable or punishable. What does that mean? I haven't heard that before.
So it basically meant that the classic behaviour change techniques that you would use with a child didn't really work.
A sticker chart sort of.
Yeah, sticker chart's not going to work. If you wanted her to get rid of her dummy or anything like that, and they were like, grab her, get her a present, wrap it, put it in the corner, and say that when she gets rid of it, she could have that. She literally would just turn her back on it. This was like a 2.5-year-old.
Wow.
She just ignored the present. She was just like, I'm not interested. So yeah, we had to find different ways to guide her. And so that really became about working on our relationship. So, and just a completely different approach to parenting. But that really influenced how I did my research. So when we were I did research in how children eat and helping parents with feeding their children. And so that was really about how to build the bi-directional relationship between the parent and the child, which basically meant that, yes, the parent is responsive to the child, but we want the child to be good for the parent as well. So it's easier for the parent to, that back and forth relationship rather than just the parent constantly like giving and the child can kind of do whatever they want. So that was where that came from. And that's kind of the lens through which I think about everything now, particularly social media and kids, because one of my biggest concerns is that it's interfering with that attachment between the parent and the child, which is very, very protective for mental health.
Yep. And you've mentioned that even early on, quite young children we're talking about, and their brain development and their connection development with their parents. What do you see as the main impacts with technology and social media that you're seeing in the research?
It's harder to, measure some of these things. And so what I like to look at is, well, what we know is good for child development and how might social media be interfering with that. So rather than just kind of measuring social media and looking at outcomes, we can be like, well, what has the last 20, 30, 40 years of research taught us about what is good for childhood? And so that's kind of what I'm always thinking about. So we know that children are meant to be playing. We know that they're meant to be, problem solving and things like that. And we know that they're meant to be talking face to face with first parents and then the wider community and other kids and stuff like that. Spending time in nature, having lots of downtime for when they get older, for the adolescent years, for self-reflection. And we do know that social media is displacing heaps of these activities. In particular, a really strong one is obviously sleep. So we know sleep's really important for all kinds of brain development. So sleeping is almost like a bath for the brain. So it gets rid of toxins from the brain when you're asleep. And so if something's interfering with these processes, we need to be mindful of that. It's certainly something that we should be aware of and not just disregard and say, well, we need, 20, 30 years of research in order to prove that this is harming our kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's been a lot of feedback from teachers and principals about the sleep thing, that kids are coming to school tired from screen use late into the night. But what is actually happening to the brain of an adolescent when they're using social media? What's going on in there?
So a number of things are happening. So, for example, we know short form videos are reducing their attention spans and their memory as well. So things like that, really important for cognitive development, for doing well in school. We know in the adolescent years in particular that there's kind of this explosion of growth in the limbic system, or the emotional part of the brain, while the prefrontal cortex, which is where, the decision-making, self-regulation, all that sort of stuff, really important skills, that's kind of continuing to develop in a linear fashion. And so you get this mismatch between the two. So one way of thinking about it is the adolescent brain does tend to be all gas pedal motion and very little brake. And what we know from the research is that when kids are on social media and screens, the emotional part of the brain is lit up, so that's being used a lot, and there is not so much activity happening in the prefrontal cortex. So that's another way. And
the prefrontal cortex, that's the forward-thinking, consequence, decision-making part of the brain.
That's and that's not really fully developed until 25 years. So no amount of teaching kids is going to change that. That's just a reality. You could have the smartest kid in the world because they're still not going to have that, because intelligence and maturation, brain maturation, are different things. Another thing to think about is the content that they're watching. So that impacts the brain as well. So we know that, say, watching porn. So kids come across a lot of porn on social media, and we know that that actually atrophies the prefrontal cortex, and it also interferes with the relationship or the way that the brain is communicating between the reward part of the brain and the prefrontal cortex. So that's reduced, which means that people who watch a lot of pornography, they are desensitized to the content. So in order to get the effect that you would expect it to have, they have to see more and more extreme stuff. So that's kind of content. And then obviously the classic thing is the reward pathways of the brain. So basically, dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, very important for reward and motivation. We would die without it. But when we engage in things that maybe are a little bit of hard work, we should be rewarded for that. And it feels good, makes us want to do it again. So something like talking to somebody new, doing some exercise, studying for a test, all really important things. We should be rewarded for that and motivated to do it again. Now, the difference with social media is that it's kind of an unnatural peak in our dopamine level. So it spikes it unnaturally. So it goes quite high. And those are things like getting a like, because that's, social validation, which is particularly important for the adolescent brain because they are more vulnerable to it. So getting likes, people sharing your posts, seeing new content, novel content, also self-disclosure, so talking about ourselves online, all that is rewarding to the brain. So we get this unnatural spike in dopamine for a activity that doesn't actually take a heck of a lot of work, right? So that's kind of key to this, is that it's an easy thing to do to get your dopamine hit. And then your dopamine level can kind of go below its baseline level. And you just kind of experience that as a little bit of craving or whatever. So if it was something like eating a piece of chocolate, then there was no more chocolate left, your baseline level would return to normal. Now, the problem with things like social media or gaming or any other kind of addictive things is that if you can get access to them really easily, then you're going to hit on them more. You want more of it, so you get back on social media and you get that hit of dopamine again. And over time, that kind of just floods the brain and can lead to a dopamine deficit state, which is experienced as depression and things like that. What concerns me is that it also means that kids will find, basically the things that we're meant to find rewarding are no longer rewarding. So your kid doesn't want to go outside and play in nature.
Because it's kind of boring to their brain.
It's boring to their brain. And so I think that's really important. So basically the addiction pathway is, you get these little spikes in dopamine, feels good. If you can access it again, when you get that craving state, access it again, you get another hit of dopamine, around and around and around it goes. And what we know about the adolescent brain, it is more vulnerable to addiction. And so it's more sensitive to rewards. And so some research has shown that over 90% of adults with an addiction, that it actually started in the teen years. So we want to be really careful with what our kids are doing as teenagers.
So it sounds like in the research and your experience, there's real vulnerable stages throughout adolescence that can really impact someone's life and well-being throughout their life.
Yeah, so what is happening during the adolescent stage? So you need a little bit of background about how the brain develops. So when we're very little, so the first 3 years, everybody knows about the first 3 years, our brains becoming
1,000 days.
Yeah.
Everything's getting wired up.
Yeah.
And then the adolescent years hit, and our brains are trying to become, they're reorganising to become more efficient. And so two main things really happening here. So the first is that the pathways that we're using are turning into essentially superhighways for the information to pass through. So what we do a lot of during our adolescent years really becomes what we're good at as adults.
Right.
Which is important if you're thinking about just looking at a screen the whole time. But the other thing that's happening is pruning. So getting rid of those pathways that we're not using anymore. So one of the things that happens in the adolescent years, particularly when screens are involved, is that they displace activities that we know are really good for you. So you're spending heaps of time on social media, but we're doing less things like sleeping, which we've already spoken about, spending time in face-to-face communication, which is very rewarding. It's an important part of adolescence is developing the skills of communication with people, getting along with other people, being physically active, things like listening to music or playing musical instruments. So they light up the brain pretty much more than any other activity. So, kids who play a musical instrument do better in academics than kids who don't. So these are all things that we want our kids to be doing, but they're being displaced by social media.
And I guess there's the piece for boredom as well, because when your brain is not full, then you have that space to think creatively and to think of interesting things to do and ways to let that creative force out. But if that space is constantly being filled with that dopamine loop from your phone and social media, that boredom creativity piece is lost.
Well, it's interesting because a number of academics in New Zealand talk about social media being good for creativity and good for identity formation. And I would challenge that for that reason. So you have to think about, well, what conditions do we need to be creative? And what the research tells us is that kids who spend a lot of time passively scrolling on social media are actually less creative, so it reduces their creativity. And kids who are being interactive on social media in what we would consider, making videos and stuff, being creative, that doesn't increase their creativity. And it makes sense to me because, they don't have that time. So social media, you're on there, you're trying to get likes and things, so you're not taking risks with what you're doing creatively, but then you don't have time for downtime. And downtime is really important for self-reflection. And I can talk about identity formation in a second. But we need downtime for our brain to process things that it hasn't had a chance to process, and for new thoughts to come in and to think about those thoughts. And so we know that research shows that most kids today say they are constantly on social media. So there's not a heck of a lot of time for self-reflection. And I think that's really concerning.
How much time are we talking?
Well, I mean, I just think about when we were young. Most nights I spent heaps of time alone in my bedroom listening to music, writing, things like that. Every night, you know, we had time for self-reflection. There was downtime. And so many parents say to me, gaming or social media is really good for my kid because they're constantly in contact with their friends. But humans aren't meant to be constantly in contact with their friends. They're meant to have time with their family and away from external sources, but they're also meant to have time with themselves.
Time to decompress.
Yeah, exactly. So the identity formation piece of the puzzle is interesting. So identity formation is a process that begins to happen around 11 to 15 years. It's when your kid begins to figure out who they are and what they value and things like that. In order for that to take place, they need to go out into the community. So they need to be exposed to new ideas, which social media does do. But then they need time away from that as well to think about it, to see how it aligns with what they value and what their family values, what their community values, and, you know, align those things to think about what's important to them. Now, social media is just constant input from other people, other people's values, other people's ideas. But the other thing that happens is that once our kids, we often go down rabbit holes, we get into echo chambers. So we're not actually being exposed to all these different ideas in the community. We tend to be exposed to just a very narrow window. And once you're in there, it's actually very hard to get out of there because you may lose your community because your community is based on the same values and ideas and things like that. So I would argue that social media is not a great place for our kids to be developing their identity.
But then also on that, there's the validation that comes from it. You know, if you're expressing yourself online in a certain way and suddenly you get all this validation when you are expressing one part of yourself compared to another part of yourself, naturally you're going to think, oh, that feels quite good. I got rewarded for that. I'm going to double down on that. I'm going to show more of that. And so then you're actually letting the validation from these algorithms form your identity for you. And so is that necessarily an authentic identity that you're forming, or is that you molding yourself according to the validation that you get that feels good online?
Well, I think that's exactly what's happening, and that's what kids tell us is happening. So there is research that's been done where they've done focus groups with young people, so they've just spoken to young people, and they talk about this, that they change themselves in this feedback loop. So they see what they get positive feedback from online, and they will change themselves. And I was listening to one young New Zealand girl talking about this last year on the radio, and she actually said, we're all beginning to sound exactly like each other on social media, right? Because they know what is okay and they know what isn't okay. And so they're just like this homogenous group of young people today who say and do the same things, which I think is super concerning. And I think another part of that is also, so my colleague in Australia, Dr Danielle Einstein, so she's a psychologist, but she's also a researcher. And she talks about this concept of self-disclosure online, so talking about yourself, getting likes and things. But that's actually not how we develop resilience. So what's really meant to happen is something bad happens in our day, and we're meant to kind of unpack it with somebody close to us. So like mum or dad or a very close friend. And that process of unpacking it helps us see kind of what happened, where we may have gone wrong, understanding it. And that builds resilience over time. Whereas when you're on social media and you go to your little group and you're like, this happened, you just get like a million messages back saying you're amazing, and there's no real development going on there. So it's not really like actual social interactions that we grew up with in the real world. It is quite different.
Well, this is also a whole side issue, but now with the introduction of the AI companions as well, that's a whole nother thing, because then these kids are then confiding in these AI chatbots that just say, you're amazing, you're amazing, you're amazing, you're always right, I'm always wrong, you're perfect. And so that's a whole other can of worms. But what about, because this is obviously an issue for adults as well as young people, and is it just that people in our generation can handle this a little bit more? We're more aware as to what's going on in terms of these dopamine loops and validation online because we had a childhood that was social media free, or is it just because our brains are more developed?
So I think there's a couple of points there. The first is about the dopamine and understanding that. And I think it's really important to remember that despite understanding what social media is doing to your brain, it's still doing it to your brain. Like knowing about it doesn't change that, which is why when you hear people talk about education, you can educate everybody about this. You can educate them to death. It's still not going to change the fact that short form videos decreases their attention spans. The other thing is that, yes, so during that adolescent window, they are more vulnerable to the impacts of social media. And research does show that. And that is because as we said, they're more sensitive to social rewards. They've got that mismatch between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. And they're more vulnerable to the dopamine and stuff like that. So we are better placed to handle it as adults. We are. But having said that, lots of adults will tell you that this is also an issue for them as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, and we have seen that with other things, I guess, we've normalised in society where we know it's harmful, so we age restrict, like alcohol, tobacco, gambling. What have you seen in the research landscape? Why haven't we moved with social media?
It's a good question. It's kind of hard to answer, but at the same time, what I'm seeing is just what we saw with big tobacco. It's just playing out again, right? And this is done it over time and time again with other commercial determinants of health. And so that is what social media is. So people are making a heck of a lot of money off a product that has been sold to them. Tobacco companies did a whole lot of things to help them so that they wouldn't be regulated. So they did things like hiding the science in public. So they knew that tobacco was harming, leading to lung cancer, leading to heart disease, but they hid it in public. And we've seen that with social media. So I'm sure most people know, but Meta did research, internal research, and then publicly said, from what we can see, social media is good. All the research is showing that social media could be good for youth mental health or their relationships and things like that, while hiding the fact that they have done their own internal research and shown harm. And it was only because of a 2021 investigative Wall Street Journal, where they got leaked documents. And they showed that actually they do know it's harming our kids. So that's one way. They're doing a number of things like that. So these companies, if you look at social media, it was like kind of on the eve of when Australia was coming out with their age restriction or that policy change, and then suddenly there were we've made accounts safer for teens and things like that. Tinkering around the edges, not a heck of a lot of actually changing what makes these products harmful to kids, but to avoid regulation. And another thing that they have been doing as well is they've been funding youth organisations and organisations tasked with keeping our kids safe. So tobacco companies did this as well. In New Zealand, Lifeline is funded by Meta, NetSafe is. That's not to say, they both of those groups have actually had quite strong opinions against regulation for social media. That's not to say that they wouldn't anyway, but it is hard to, that's quite a conflict of interest that we should be aware of. And the New Zealand public should be aware of this stuff because this is exactly the tactics of big tobacco. So I do think there's a lot of stuff like that happening. With respect to public health, we're always wanting more information. And this is another thing that tobacco companies said that I've heard time and time again in New Zealand, which is the science isn't settled, which the science is almost never settled. That's just life.
That's a good point.
It's kind of a bit misleading. it could be 20, 30, 40, 50 years before the science is settled in this area. But we do, and we increasingly have enough information to show that it is causing harm to our kids. So yeah, I think that is partly why things have been a bit slow in this area.
Yeah. It is confusing, and I think it's quite a tell that some of these big social media platforms have actually done something, because I guess there's an acknowledgement that we know it's harmful. Can you just do a deeper sort of dive on why you think their strategies won't work? Because it's quite confusing. You say, we've put age restrictions, we've put parental controls, but you mentioned a lot of the elements of social media which make it addicting.
Yeah, so you need to, if we're really going to address the issue of social media and how it's impacting our kids, then we need to target the things like all the pathways through which social media is harming our kids. And so algorithms is one of them. Algorithms, push harmful content towards our kids.
And so that's different from maybe a generation before who Google searched. I want to know about cats, I Google cats. This is more, something's just showing you things without prompting.
So AI is basically machine learning, where it's looking at what you're doing, looking how much you look at liking something, looking at a video or not looking at a video, creating a little picture of a child, and then comparing it to another child somewhere and seeing what holds that child's attention, and then sending that content to your child. So it's not what they want to see.
It's stuff they can't really look away from.
And it's even lingering on something, isn't it? Yeah. You don't even have to engage with it. You don't have to like it. You don't have to comment on it. Even just an extra linger, it will pick that up.
It is watching everything your child does to create this picture. And that is because novel content, so it sends content that is going to potentially cause an emotional reaction in your child, because that is what holds attention. So whether that is making them feel happy or sad or enraged, these things are the things that will hold our kids' attention. So that is what's going to be driven to your kids, not just more cat videos.
I think that's one of the confusing things, because we've had it where I might go onto a social media platform and it'll say stuff about gardening or Bitcoin, and I think it's not that bad, but then we've had adults sign in as a 13-year-old girl and be shocked at the kind of material they'll see. Yeah,
so that does seem to be happening. And it was interesting because I was doing a guest lecture for a group of BED students a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking, because I don't tend to talk about content, because we can talk about that later, but if we just focus on content, then our approach to addressing it is going to be content restrictions. The problem is much deeper than that. But what happened was I said to these group of early 20-somethings what kids in Auckland were seeing in schools last year. And they were shocked. I said it thinking that they were going to be like, yes, we've seen this before. But they were all like, I felt really bad that I hadn't given them a warning. But yeah, so, even they're out of touch with what young people are seeing today.
Can you say what some of that stuff was?
So the classic kind of two was like beheadings. So, drug cartels.
Whoa.
But I think the worst one, and I'm going to say there was some talk that this was AI generated, so was putting a kitten in a blender and blending up the kitten. So they were quite shocked with that one. And it was interesting because when you speak to younger people, they're not so shocked by it. So they definitely are being fed different stuff than
I think we both skipped a heartbeat there. That's pretty awful stuff.
That's horrible. But I even see it in my own algorithm. Every so often I'll get fed a video that I know is being fed to me to shock me. And usually it's something about like a baby being upset, or a little child, or an Instagram trend where there's a child being shamed. I don't know if you guys have seen stuff like this, but there was a trend where parents would crack an egg on their child's head, and it was like this funny prank trend. And I just kept getting fed these horrible videos that I couldn't stand, because the algorithm was like, you're not going to like this. Yeah. So
but you're going to stay on.
Here's some more, because I know that you're gonna engage with it in some way. It's terrible, and that's me. I know how my algorithm works, and I am well aware of what's happening, but still, as you say, susceptible to it.
Yeah, so that's one piece of the puzzle is the algorithm. Back to your first question. And then the other things are like short film videos, which we've talked about, image-based content, so very harmful to body image issues and eating disorders. That's very strongly related. But then also just persuasive design. So there are so many things going on in social media that are there just to hold your attention for as long as possible, not just the algorithm. And so when you're talking about these platforms making some changes to make them safe, unless they're dealing with that stuff, unless they're going to stop kids comparing themselves to other kids online, unless they're stopping cyberbullying, social exclusion is a massive one. It's really easy to exclude somebody online, and kids say this is very common. So about 50% of kids say that their friends have purposely left them out of group chats and things like that. What's concerning is that young people find that very traumatic, and some even have PTSD symptoms from that, from being left out on group chats. So unless they're doing something somehow to address all those things, it's still going to be harming our kids, And,
absolutely.
And so I think that's kind of key.
And I guess that's interesting that you say that, because a lot of feedback on before 16 or changing the social media age is that, well, this is how kids connect and this is how kids communicate in the modern world. But what you just said kind of contradicts that, doesn't it? Because at least if there's social exclusion in the real world, you still have some sort of reprieve when you are home, you're by yourself, you're with your family. But now it's almost like the social exclusion is now augmented if it's online as well. There's no escape from it.
And I think that's really important, because that is one of the big arguments, right, is that this is where kids are and this is how they communicate. So first of all, it's where kids are because all the kids are currently there. So if you had a kid and none of their friends were on social media, it suddenly wouldn't be a great place to connect. It suddenly wouldn't be where they had to be to have friends. And of course this is true because we've all had friends and we didn't have social media when we were little. The other thing that I think is really important is people keep on saying it's a great way to connect. So pretty much every academic paper on the topic starts with it's a good place to connect. And then I'm like, okay, well, where's the research to support that? And there's not actually good research to support that. It's just something that we say. And I think it's coming from the companies themselves because, I think that's just a narrative out there. But when we actually think about it, that young people today are the loneliest generation. So this, 18 to 24-year-olds or whatever, are the loneliest generation. So they are lonelier than elderly. If social media was a great place to connect and they're on it for 3-4 hours a day,
where's the connection?
Why are they lonely?
Yeah.
Why are they lonely? It doesn't actually make any
connected
sense. Yeah,
generation.
Exactly.
But it's also, what defines connection as well? Because I could have a bunch of followers that I talk to back and forth every day, but where are the good, intimate, solid friendships that you can only keep a few of those at a time? Those really those proper friendships grounded in love and mutual respect, and people that are going to be there for you when you really need it, not turn on you in a second, which is what Instagram mobs do, especially when your connections or online friendships are built on validation. They can turn on you so quickly and the opposite thing can happen.
Well, I think that's exactly what's going on. And so what we're calling connection is how many kids are kids they're basically social networking. That's all they're doing. Yeah, it's very superficial. And research has been done into exactly what you were just talking about, which is how many friends can the human brain actually handle before it gets overwhelming. And so it's called Dunbar's number, but it's basically 3 to 5 close friends is all that we are really, or close relationships is all we've got mental capacity for. Then we've got our wider community of about 15 people who are, are kind of slightly wider, but not our close friends, but we're still good friends with. And then there's about 150 in our community. And that's just kind of everybody we know. And then that's it. So I don't know why we are so desperate for our kids to be connected to 400-500 people. It's just cognitive overload. And in order to maintain those relationships, they're ignoring the relationships in the real world, which are the relationships that matter, which are the relationships will protect you from harm. So you need the friends that when something really goes wrong in your life, they show up at your door, not that they send you a little sad face on social media or whatever. Those aren't friends. That's not going to help you.
So that's what they're missing out on.
Yeah.
Is those true friendships.
And some researchers, when they interviewed kids, and the kids were like, we definitely value our in-person friendships more. And researchers are very concerned that when something goes wrong in children's lives, not only are they going to have to be dealing with something going wrong, they're also going to be dealing with figuring out that their friends aren't their friends and that this community that they had around them isn't actually that strong a community.
What do you say to the people that say this is moral panic, that the same sort of thing happened when comic books were introduced, same thing happened when video games were introduced? What do you say to those people that think that the social media harm issue is put into those same categories?
Well, I think we should always question new technology. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Something new coming in, we should have questioned TV or whatever when it was introduced. But the difference here is that we have increasingly robust evidence showing that social media is causing harm to young people. So at some point, it's no longer a moral panic. It's it's different. It's very different to these past things.
And they're also swimming in it. I think that's the main difference as well, is that they're not just flipping through a comic book or playing a bit of PlayStation on a Saturday morning. This is 10, 12 hours a day, some kids.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend about this recently. Her son has been exposed to a lot of misogynistic stuff. And, she's like, I have the conversations, really strong values, great family. I have these conversations with my kid, but what's a 20-minute conversation once a week going to do when he is seeing this content, he's drowning in it for 4 hours a day or whatever, and then he goes to school and all his friends are seeing the exact same content, so it's more there. She's like, we can't compete with this. We can't compete with this. So when I hear people say you need to have conversations with your kids, yes, everybody needs to have these conversations with their kids. I'm not saying don't talk to your kids, but to somehow think that that's going to negate all this content and stuff that's happening, I think we need to open our eyes a little bit.
And I've always struggled with that idea that, well, the kids should decide. So I would always struggle with, so does a 10-year-old decide what kind of really bad content they should see, and then what happens to that kid afterwards?
Yeah, so, I've spoken to kids who will say this as well, and they're like, their friend will have something scary, and they're like, we'll tell them about it, and then they'll say, they'll want to see it. And then they'll like, I wish I hadn't seen it. I can't unseen it now. Yeah. Even though they knew it was bad and they weren't going to like it. And I had this recently with Charlie Kirk, and people were talking about it. And my brother was talking about it. And he was like, nobody should have to die that way. It was just brutal. I obviously didn't watch it. I'm not even on social media. But there was a part of me that wanted to see the harmful, I was curious about it. Yeah. And so what you're talking about is a narrative that definitely is coming from these companies themselves, right? Yeah. So it is corporate blame shifting, and tobacco companies did it as well. And they framed it as, well, we're going to empower young people. We're going to empower them to use these platforms in a safe way, in a way that is health promoting, ignoring the fact that there's persuasive design behind it and algorithms and short form videos, and that their brains are really vulnerable, So putting that onto the individual child, I think is so unfair. So unfair.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that, because I think there's a lot of savvy 15, 16-year-olds who are maybe more curious, and their parents are more into this idea if they're going to explore themselves online. But I really worry about the 8, 9, 10-year-olds where we see a lot of harm with social media, and I don't know how they're meant to figure this stuff out.
I don't think they can figure this stuff out, and I really, this argument that it's just about education, I think we do need to question that. So that is Public Health 101. Yeah, education doesn't work alone. Education, you need it. It's part of the puzzle, but you need policy change to change the environment and to help shift social norms. So a policy change will reflect what we value as a society, and what I think we should be valuing as a society is our kids' well-being, their brain development. What we're currently valuing is them fitting in, them being social and having lots of friends. So if we think about seatbelts, there was lots of education around seatbelts and how that would save lives, but the big thing was bringing in a policy change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've seen that before, and we've mentioned alcohol, tobacco, gambling. Yeah,
alcohol's a good example of as well, where policy was really important. So in the late 90s, I think it was, they reduced the drinking age by a couple of years. And we knew that, well, I didn't know. I did know because I was a teenager at the time, that underage people were drinking. But they knew that underage people, kids were drinking. They knew that. But when they reduced the age limit, they saw an increase in alcohol-related harms in young people. So while the policy itself wasn't 100% effective, it was setting a bit of a social norm. It was quite easy to get alcohol. And so policy is a key piece of this puzzle. And it's empowering for parents. So I've just finished some research, which I hope to get published shortly, asking parents their experience of all this. And parents are drowning. They don't know what to do. They've got kids who are saying they're going to take their own lives if they have social media taken away, that they stop using the toilet, they go on hunger strikes. This isn't some easy thing for parents to deal with, and all their friends are on it, and this is a societal issue. And we're not going to see massive change, I don't think, until we begin to shift some social norms. And education, important for understanding the problem, but it's not going to shift these norms.
Yeah, so policy is really key. And to help parents have something to say, well, look, this is what the government, this is what we're saying.
Yeah.
It's not just me saying no, it's society saying no, and everyone's all in the same boat. I think that will help to empower so many parents who feel like they're the only ones pushing back on this.
Yeah, and I think one of the narratives about it is that kids will find a workaround, which of course they will. But I think what's important is that not all kids actually want to find workarounds to break the law, but a lot of people are talking like they do want to. That's just kids are all just like desperate to break the law in order to get their social media. And one of the arguments as well is that our kids are just going to go underground. They're going to seek out this harmful content in less regulated spaces. First of all, social media is pretty unregulated. They're seeing pretty harmful content to start with. But also it's kind of, our kids aren't seeking out that content. It's being driven, algorithmically driven to them. That's why they're seeing it. And there's persuasive design, which is holding our kids on these platforms. So if we can, if our kids aren't on those platforms, I think we should be a bit more critical of that argument as well, that they're just going to go and try and seek out more harmful places on the internet. I don't think that's very respectful of our children, to be honest.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, also, kids do respond well to having some form of boundaries in place, because it helps them feel a bit safer as well, because at the moment it's the absolute Wild West. Yes, the age is 13, but it's not actually enforced. And I think that's what people don't understand as well, that at the moment there are no restrictions on it whatsoever. And so these huge tech companies are now pushing this huge responsibility onto parents who are working, trying to feed their families, and now they have to keep up with what these teams of hundreds of engineers, software designers,
neuroscientists,
psychologists are all doing, and we're expected to keep up with that at pace. It's incredibly unfair to just let them off scot-free.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh, I mean, I haven't found in my practice a parent who isn't just got this kind of, this is not good feeling inside of them.
Yeah.
And it's hard, I guess, when there isn't policy shift, because you do feel like you're fighting a bit of a lone battle. Is there anything you want parents to sort of take away, particularly from the research side, that maybe their intuition is kind of on the right track here?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, there is this narrative that the science isn't settled. And I just think question that when you hear it, because the science is usually not settled. But what we are increasingly seeing is stronger and stronger evidence from, well-designed studies showing that it's social media is linked with all these negative health outcomes, well-being outcomes, so depression, anxiety, self-harm, body image issues, poor sleep, poor academic performance, nothing that parents want for their children. So that evidence is there. It is becoming stronger and stronger. I think for parents, as I said, it's not even about the mental health issues as well. It is about what these platforms are doing to your kids' brains. And I think we need to start valuing that a bit more. And I also think parents need to know that there is stuff that we can do. Yes, policy change is really important, and that's a piece of the puzzle, but there's still stuff that parents can be doing today. And I know it will be hard, and that's part of the reason why we want policy changes, to make it easier, but also so that the kids who come from families who have very complex lives and don't have all the resources and things to help them manage their kids' social media use, we want to help those kids too. Because what I'm seeing happening right now is that the kids who come from well-off families, their parents are delaying access to social media and smartphones. That's becoming more and more of a thing, whereas social media use in other groups is increasing. And people talk about, well, there's going to be a digital divide of, we've got to get all the kids on social media because it's going to increase the digital divide. Whereas I think what's happening, there's been a shift, and this is creating a different kind of digital divide right now.
So there's a whole equity piece around Aotearoa New Zealand, and what are we doing? Because it may be the people who can invest in the connection, the offline activities, which are expensive sometimes as well.
And take time that not every family has.
Those resources that people don't have,
But if both parents are working to put food on the table, they're probably going to be a lot more vulnerable to the algorithm, to the persuasive design.
Absolutely. Because even just from a parent-child relationship perspective, we know that that's protective. And so for those kids that maybe don't have that in their lives or don't have that as strongly, they're going to be more vulnerable to whatever they encounter online. And so this isn't just about protecting individual children. We have to be protecting all New Zealand children. And I think there's also another piece of that puzzle is that there's kind of this secondhand smoke situation with social media. So my kids aren't on social media, but if everybody that they're around is on social media, that actually impacts them too. So we know that, in some schools, things like self-harm or having an eating disorder is almost a competitive sport now. So if your kid isn't on social media but it's still been exposed to that, that's likely going to impact on their mental health. Which also makes measuring the impact of social media on mental, we know if you consider that most of the researchers, we've just looked at the amount of time that a kid spends on social media and their outcomes, it does make that a little bit hazy, It's these are complex relationships.
Yeah, and you pointed to lots of different types of research. Sometimes you'll hear academics and others say, oh, this is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. But you've sort of cited lots of different bits of research. Where are we up to with the amount of research, or do we need more research? Where are we?
So I think one thing that's happening in New Zealand when they say there's a knee-jerk reaction is because to those people who haven't thought about this for a long time, it may feel that way. Some of us have been thinking about this for quite a long time and have thought about all the different ways that we might address it. And this is like, to me, it's just a key piece of the puzzle that we're not going to get anywhere majorly until we address it. So with respect to the research, again, back to tobacco companies, this is like their big thing was like there's no evidence of causation. And so that is hard for something like social media, just like it was with tobacco, because when they thought that tobacco might be causing lung cancer, it was unethical to run a study, a randomized controlled trial, where they would randomize some people to smoke and some people not to smoke, which is kind of our gold standard for figuring out whether something's causing something.
So you pick one group with one sort of exposure and one group without.
And you have to randomly assign them to them. So you're going to say, Manesh, you're going to smoke, you're not going to smoke, and let's going to see what happens. Let's see what happens in 20 years' time.
So that's called a randomised control trial.
Yeah. So you're randomising people because there may be other things at play. So you want to kind of, balance all that out.
Yeah.
So with social media, what is our option is to go back in time or into a alternate universe or parallel universe and follow kids who grow up without social media and then compare them to the kids today who are growing up with social media. That would probably give us some pretty good data about what's happening.
Hard to find.
It's quite
really
hard to find. But there are other things that we can do. So there's some research in young adults where they've done a randomised controlled trial, but it's kind of the opposite. They've reduced the amount of smartphone or social media exposure that they have. And then they see what happens. And so there's some studies that have been done and, they're 24 hours long. And lo and behold, they found that was quite harmful to people's well-being because they're likely going through withdrawal. But when they look at studies that are a week or more, so like longer than a week, they very consistently show improvements in mental health outcomes. And then when the people then go back onto social media or their smartphone, their mental health, measures return to baseline, what they were before and so that's beginning to show. I mean, it's not causation, but it's beginning to suggest that there may be a causative relationship there.
Yeah.
And coming from a non-academic background, I don't have an academic bone in my body. I wish I did. But do you find that sometimes, do you ever get frustrated because you think we can also look around us? Like we can see a lot of the harm that is happening right now. And so a lot of people are waiting for more research. But it's also like, we can also see what is happening right now. You can see it with whether it's your own kids or other people's kids or your own behaviours with
or go out
social
to a
media.
Restaurant.
Go out to a
You'll
restaurant.
see a family. Yeah.
Yeah. And the families aren't talking. Kids are on phones. Parents are on their phones. And you think, do I need research to tell me that is not beneficial to a family?
So I think you definitely need research. Like, of course you need research, but 100% it drives me insane that people, and that's what parents keep on saying, show me the research. And I'm like, you can see this harm, and it could be a really long time before that definitive research comes out. And what I'm really concerned about right now is that we have some pretty good evidence, and our generation of kids today, if we don't act now, when they're in their early 20s or mid-20s, they're going to look back and question why we didn't do anything. And I'm really, really worried about that and how that's going to play out with respect to generational tensions and things like that. Why, when we had all this evidence, were we so dead set on protecting the companies and their profits rather than protecting our kids?
And sometimes protecting the comfort, I think,
is
a part of it.
It is a part of it. I mean, it is really hard if you have a teenage kid who isn't on social media and all their friends are on it. Like, that can be harming as well, I mean, I think you can do it. There are things that you can do, and I talk in schools about that, but it's hard. It's hard work. And most parents don't have that ability to put all those things in place.
Or they don't have the support. So what do you recommend for parents that are listening and they think, I want to do this, I want to support my kids through getting them off social media if they're already in there? What advice would you give them?
So it's kind of a staged process. So the first thing I would say is you need to get a support network around you. So you need to get, as much as you can, your partner on board if you have a partner. That may not even always happen, especially when people are co-parenting. Grandparents on board. You need to talk to your child's friends' parents. So when your kid goes around to their house, that they know that this is something that you're doing. And this isn't a judgment about what they're doing. This is just what you're doing for your family. Educate yourself, because the more education you have, the more knowledge you have, the more conviction you'll have, because this is not going to be easy. When you make the plan to take, say, social media away or disconnect your kid, you have to have a conversation with your kid. And this isn't up for discussion. You're telling them, but in a warm way. So my number one recommendation is do not take smartphone away from your child as a punishment. So something's gone wrong and you're like, we have to get rid of this, because that is the worst thing. This is not a punishment. We didn't realise there was all this research. Now we know there's this research, and we're doing this for you, for your well-being. And one thing that I think is also can be really important is we're going to look at our own media use, social media use, tech use as well. We're doing this as a family because this has gotten out of control.
I love that.
And we're going to prioritise our relationships now and things like that. Then you have to think about, if you do take a smartphone away, social media away, you need to replace it with a camera and a dumb phone probably, and, whatever. But then once you've done it, and be prepared that it could be, your life's going to be hell on wheels for a couple of weeks. It's not an easy process. So I've worked with some families who have had to call in the police. Some families, when their kids really are heavily dependent on social media, need the support of a psychologist to go through this process. But the thing is that once you come through that process and their baseline dopamine levels have returned to their normal baseline levels, is all the things that your kids should be doing, you can introduce back into their life. So they've got more time for it, but they're also going to find it rewarding again. So when I talk in schools, I talk about the things, activities that will help build executive function. So making sure your kid packs their bag at night, lays out their clothes, makes their lunches, things like that. Activities that are just kind of life skills, because we want our kids to grow up to be adults who are quite capable. So getting them to help around the house. And this kind of got two main benefits. So the first is it's really hard to like your kid if you're vacuuming around them, making dinner, and they're just sitting there scrolling on their phone. That's really hard. But second of all, there is some research to show that getting your kids to do things that just scare them a little bit, just pushes them outside of their boundaries a little bit, like going and paying for something at the local dairy, making family dinner, that's actually quite effective treatment for anxiety. So, there are benefits to that. And then really focusing on relationships, rebuilding connection. So connection with the parents, connection with their friends. So get the friends to come over to the house every Friday night or once a week or once a month. Have a basket at the front door, put their smartphones in. This is a, smartphone-free house. And some kids will say no, they're not going to do that. And I know that's really hard for parents to hear and to see, to witness that. But those are the kids that aren't going to be there for your kid anyway when things go wrong, right? So you're trying to build a real community around your children, and then also getting your kids to spend heaps of time by themselves. So creating space and time just for them to get them out into nature. And so just getting all those activities that we know are really good for child development back into their lives, which is only going to happen if you remove social media from their lives.
Those are some really good tips. And I think some of this you just kind of see through schools. Teachers will often give kids little jobs, and it's quite rewarding, isn't it? And for some reason we don't often translate that into a home environment.
I mean, I think part of the issue that has happened is we're being captured by social media as well. And there are narratives that are unhelpful for parents. So the digital natives narrative. So that kind of does two things. It implies that our children are thriving with technology, which I would question. But it also kind of says that we don't understand our children. And so we're just kind of being told to leave them to it, or I've heard people say, jump in the water, get on social media and see what your kids are doing, as if that is somehow going to be protective for our kids. And we're bombarded with messages that this is just normal now and that parents shouldn't be. I mean, there are some recommendations in New Zealand that say basically, even when something bad happens on social media, don't give in to the temptation to take it away from your kid, because social media use is normal now and that's where all the children are. So that is the advice that has been given to New Zealand children or to New Zealand parents at the moment.
Not helpful.
It's really not helpful, is it? But I'll tell you what is helpful, and that's your work. So that's, I think parents listening will be able to get a lot out of this and just have some form of a plan as well, because it can feel like you're just feeling around in a dark room thinking this doesn't feel right, but I don't know what to do about it and I don't know how to move forward.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in the space for a very long time and I've read a lot of articles. I've spoken to a lot of parents, a lot of teachers, a lot of doctors. My kids aren't having access to this stuff. I wouldn't put this stuff in the hands of anybody that I love, and I mean that genuinely. So when I talk on this topic, I am living this. I am not, saying, but then my kids are on it. I am very, very concerned for our children.
That's a powerful statement. That love, this is why I've taken this approach. That's really powerful.
Dr Samantha Marsh, thank you so much for your time today. I've so appreciated learning from you.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Sam.
Cool.
Thanks for listening to One Young Mind. We're on a mission to understand what our tamariki are experiencing online, to listen, connect, and make sense of this challenging topic, bringing the conversation to the forefront. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe so you never miss an episode, and share it with someone who cares about the well-being of young people.
We'd also like to thank everyone who makes this podcast possible. We simply couldn't do it without you. Executive producers Flicker Williams and Julie Clothier, editor Luke Johnson, Omzi for our branding and design, and the recording team at PodLab, and our commercial partners 2 Degrees and iHeartRadio and the team at Before 16. Thanks for listening. Ka kite anō.